Now that we've gotten the landscape of SOA circa 2011 with our great case studies, it's time now to drill deeper with our expert solo sessions. And for this one, I'm joined by Alistair Farquharson, CTO at SOA Software. Alistair, welcome back.
Thanks, Vance. Looking forward to it.
At SOA Software, Alistair Farquharson spearheads product design and development and helps enterprise customers implement SOA for ongoing business benefits. He is a noted expert in custom application development, distributed environments, architecting scalable hardware and software, and SOA Governance. Prior to joining SOA Software, he worked at US Interactive, where he was a key advisor to the CTO on many companies regarding Internet architecture issues. In his session, Best Practices for SOA Governance, Alistair describes 3 keys to successful SOA projects: clear business alignment, measurable ROI, and a more agile IT environment. He also connects the dots to show how important it is to apply these keys across the whole SOA lifecycle, from design, development, test, deploy, and update. We'll see how SOA Governance has become one of today's most popular ways companies are accomplishing this balancing act. Just a quick reminder, if you haven't already done so, you can download Alistair's slides by clicking the download button at the right, and to ask a question, simply type into the submit a question box. And now, Alistair, tell us about best practices for SOA Governance.
Thank you. So not to repeat myself, but certainly I think it's worthwhile to review sort of why SOA in the first place. I think that it's important to note that SOA is about transforming an IT department, and it is about aligning that IT department ultimately with your company's business goals. I think that a successful SOA strategy needs to provide a transparent business alignment. It needs to have and demonstrate a measurable return on investment, and it really needs to provide, at the end of the day, a more agile IT environment. So let's look a little bit at the challenge. The challenge that we've found with SOA is that SOA is not about technology. It's really something that is about people and processes. So I would say that a successful SOA strategy is one that aligns first people and processes, and then ultimately takes care of a technology that is going to implement and manage those people and processes. So it's not primarily a technical problem, and it cannot be solved by technology alone. And it's also not something, and I think that this is probably the key point here that people have sort of lost sight of, it's not something that can be done outside of a business context or without any business support. If I just think over the past sort of 5 years and think of the SOA projects that have succeeded and the ones that have failed, the ones that have failed have typically been those projects that have had no business support, no executive sponsorship, no ability to actually meet their end goals, and just end up with a bunch of technology that ultimately costs a lot of money and slows down your operational environment. So I think it's really important to establish the context of your SOA initiative within some sort of business goals and along with business support. And I'm going to elaborate this as I go through my presentation. So let's look at the common best practices that I'm seeing. And I'm going to talk anecdotally about these best practices and try and put them in the context of real-world scenarios or customer case studies. The first best practice, as you might have gathered, is people, process, then technology. I'm going to talk about how to take care of the people and processes within your organization and then ultimately start looking at technology. Speaking of technology, there is a tool for every job. The SOA landscape, like many other technical landscapes within our day-to-day jobs, is complex, and there are many, many tools that can do many, many different things. And there's always a danger that if you have a hammer, everything starts looking like a nail. So what I'm going to try and do is talk about which tools to get and which people should be using those tools and which function those tools should actually provide. The third best practice I'm going to discuss is end-to-end. I'm talking about how one should actually look at the entire life cycle. Then I'm going to also talk about integrate and automate. And I covered this in my introductory session, but integrating and automating provides return on investment and lower total cost of ownership for a service-oriented architecture. And then last but not least, I'm going to also discuss what I call closing the loop, which is essentially how do you actually provide a way of enforcing the policies and a way of implementing the policies in your environment with the minimal amount of impact. So let's start at the beginning. People, processes, then technology. So we have seen SOA strategies initiated by different parts of the organization. And if I look at the sales engagements we've had with our customers over the past few years, I can see that we sort of see SOA initiatives on three fronts. The first one being an IT-led initiative. Primarily, an IT department is looking to monitor and secure their environment. The problem with tackling it at that level is that it's very difficult for an IT department to justify new tools. Imagine if I'm an IT department and I want to go out and purchase some SOA tools, and I go to the business and say, well, this SOA tool provides me with the ability of monitoring and securing my services. The likelihood is they'll turn around and say, well, you already have 3 tools to do monitoring and 5 tools to do security. Why do you need another one? And it's very, very difficult to actually justify the acquisition of a set of tools that do monitoring and security without the context of a larger SOA initiative. The second group of people we often interact with is development groups. Development groups are typically focused on a particular project or constrained within a particular line of business, and their focus on services we find to be very bottom-up. So what I mean by that is they are trying to simplify their service development initiatives. They are trying to perhaps simplify how they build services, or perhaps provide or supply a repository of services to the broader organization. Now, what we find with initiatives that are led by a development group is it's very often limited to a single project or line of business. And in this case, again, it's difficult to justify the purchase of a tool, and you very often don't have enough clout within the organization to create best practices that are applicable to the whole organization. And what you end up having is you end up producing services that nobody else uses and nobody else cares about. You end up spending a lot of money building those services without any measurable return on investment. The most successful projects that we encounter are ones that are driven and led by enterprise architecture, CIO, Office of the CTO, that kind of group within the organization. These are most successful because they are driven by the business and they have sufficient support to implement change across the organization. They are essentially responsible and capable of leading a transformation initiative within the company. They are also capable of realizing a return on investment, not because they are technically more competent, but just because they are more capable of aligning the service initiatives with what's going on in the business. They are more capable of getting the levels of reuse because they have access to a larger organization. The problem that you might already know or be aware of is that it's sometimes difficult for these organizations within the company to generate the consensus and budget that they require. So they often have to go to each of the project teams and each of the lines of business and get their consensus and financial support to implement an SOA. We do, however, find that to be a simpler problem to solve than one that comes up through the other two avenues, where you've built a bunch of services and no one cares about them, or you're just implementing another monitoring and security tool and it's lost all recognition as being an SOA initiative in the first place. So our most successful projects are EA, CIO, Office of the CTO led, and that's simply because the problem is not one about technology, but rather one about people and process and business alignment, and in many cases, politics within an organization, simply because this is a strategic and transforming initiative within a company. So let's look at the next best practice, choosing the right tool for the job. So in my last slide, I harped on about people and process and getting the right sort of support within the organization. And I mentioned that tooling is tertiary to people and process within the company. That said, you still need to choose the right tools. And there's a lot of fear and uncertainty and doubt out there as to which tools to use. And I think there's a lot of misrepresentation of tools in the marketplace. Before I go into the specific tools, let's just talk about why SOA initiatives actually need a technology investment. So it's really, really difficult to control people and to communicate a process without some medium to reach those people and a way to actually communicate that process. So I think that whatever technology investments are made need to be looked at in that light. They need to be tools that help you manage people and change and communicate processes within the organization. The second thing is the tools need to help you measure your return on investment. When you go into an SOA project, you're probably going to have to justify your own existence and establish some sort of criteria by which you're going to measure the success of this initiative at the end of a year or 2 years or 6 months. So the tools that you choose need to be able to actually provide that measurable return on investment. The tools also need to be able to automate and audit the governance processes that you put in place. I'll talk a little bit about automation later on when I talk about integrate and automate, but essentially automation actually adds to the return on investment and lowers the total cost of ownership of SOA. It simplifies the development processes that you put in place, and it actually offers a carrot back to the organization as to why you need to make a tool investment in the first place. When you look at tools, you need to look at the entire life cycle. Planning, development, and operational aspects all need to be considered, and they all need different tools. And as I mentioned, I'll also get to this later on when I talk about the entire life cycle. The danger that exists is that choosing the wrong tools or having the wrong focus can really put an organization down a rat hole. You can spend a lot of time analyzing a tool or spending a lot of time trying to get that square peg to fit in that round hole to implement whatever development processes and governance processes you want to put into place. So it's really important that you choose the right tool. That said, common mistakes are building a bunch of services. So if you think about my last slide where some SOA governance projects or SOA initiatives are driven by development, in many cases what happens is a service gets built for a service's sake. It's not built with some end use in mind or a consumer in mind. So in many cases, many failures can be related to just building a bunch of services that nobody uses at the end of the day. Another common mistake is looking at the architecture as a homogeneous entity as opposed to a heterogeneous entity. Most of our customers are heterogeneous. They have multiple platforms, multiple ESBs, multiple BPM tools, multiple development environments. So the SOA problem as a whole is a heterogeneous one. If you tackle a particular line of business or a particular development organization, the danger is that you would tackle it with a single technology in mind. And the processes and practices you put into place will not apply to other technologies within the organization. And that's the danger as well. The other danger is forcing consolidation and standardization using an ESB. I believe that an ESB is a bit of a misnomer in that it is not an enterprise service bus. It's very, very difficult to consolidate and standardize on a single ESB within an organization, simply because organizations are heterogeneous and every single platform vendor offers their own ESB. So just by the general nature of developers and the general nature of organizations, you will end up with more than one ESB. So instead of trying to force everyone to consolidate and standardize on a single ESB, which will be very difficult to manage and very difficult to gain consensus for, a better approach is just to let everyone have their own ESB and ensure that you can govern them all evenly. The last common mistake we find is that registries and repositories have a special purpose and a particular target audience. It's very, very difficult to implement a runtime registry and get a development team to use it or get an operations person to leverage a development repository. It is not a case of one size fits all. You have to look at the life cycle and you have to look at the people that are using the tools. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. The next best practice is end-to-end. As I mentioned, an SOA strategy really does have to encompass the entire life cycle. You have to look at planning, development, and operations when looking at an SOA strategy. The reason for this is how can you actually measure your success when your initial goals are poorly defined? So if you're just implementing operational governance, you don't really know what the context is of the governance activities that you're implementing. You don't understand how they relate back to business strategic initiatives. You don't understand necessarily what the budget is or what the cost savings goals might be. So it's very, very difficult for you to actually report on any kind of success if there are no quantifiable metrics and no goals established in the first place. So it's difficult to do development and operational governance without having some kind of planning governance put into place. One of the key drivers for SOA is agility, but this really can't be measured if you have no idea of how long it takes to go from planning through development to operations. How are you going to measure that your projects are being completed with a 20% time saving if you have no idea when they started and when they ended? So this is a classic example of how you actually need to look at the entire life cycle, how you need to relate your SOA initiative back to your business drivers, how you need to map your services back to the strategic initiatives that the organization has. I would say that you want to minimize the number of services that you produce within your organization. You want those services to have clear business value, clear return on investment, and clear benefit to you as an IT organization. The next best practice, which I spoke about before, is integrate and automate. If you think about my previous slide, I discussed the fact that you have to look at this SOA initiative from end to end, planning, development, and governance. Now, the key thing, of course, to any kind of metric or any kind of reporting is that you actually have to integrate these three stages of the life cycle. In planning, you have tools that do portfolio management. In development, you have tools that provide you with repositories, integrate with IDEs, integrate with build management. In operations, you have effectively a set of management tools. These tools at these different stages of the life cycle must be integrated to simplify and lower the overall total cost of ownership for that SOA initiative, provide reporting on quantifiable metrics, and automate the common use cases such as provisioning, SLA management, and policy inheritance. Let me give you an anecdotal example. A lot of people have portfolio management tools, a lot of people have repositories, and there is no end to management tools in an operational environment. The biggest problem is there's no way, well, these different tools have different representations for the different things that they're managing. There's no way to look at your portfolio management system and correlate that to some asset within development and correlate that to some activity in your operational environment. There's no consistent representation of a service, and there's no clear view of what the relationships are between business initiatives, applications that are being built, and services running in an operational environment, unless you integrate those tools together. Once you integrate those tools together, it's very easy to create reports that says, well, I have these three services produced by this application. It was developed 20% quicker than the version before it, and it is specifically designed to meet the following three business initiatives. The other thing that automation actually provides and the integration actually provides is a lower total cost of ownership. The highest cost inside an organization is people. The other high cost is, of course, QA and support and management. So if you can integrate your systems and you can automate a lot of your processes, that has two benefits. The first one is it lowers the cost of the initial development and deployment activity, and it also reduces the risk of any kind of failure in your production environment. So just as an example, if you automate provisioning and a developer goes into the repository and says, well, I would like access to a particular service. If the repository then sends an email off to somebody and asks that person for approval, and that person says, yes, I approve that, the underlying system needs to understand what the credentials are of that individual, and it needs to be able to modify the access control rules in the operational environment before the application actually hits the environment. So if I can automate and I can control the provisioning of a service and control access to that service based on decisions made during development time, I have taken X number of hours out of the deployment activities and the cost of ownership of that particular application. If a developer gets to pick and choose a service level within the development lifecycle or during planning, and that service level is automatically reported on, then you've saved a great deal of time in configuring your operational management tools. If you can inherit policy based on things like your information model or the meta model of a service, then you have saved the time that it's going to take and the risk of a misappropriation of a particular policy or exposure of customer data to the outside world. So automating the common use cases will ultimately save you money, it'll improve your agility, and will lower the total cost of ownership of your IT environment. The next best practice, which I believe is my last, is about closing the loop. Closing the loop is kind of an extension of the existing messages that I've been trying to get across. Closing the loop is when you take and ensure the end-to-end fidelity and relevance of your policies and processes. When you report back into your development and planning process what is actually happening in your operational environment. When you automate the enforcement of policies. When you report and audit on the effectiveness of a particular policy or application lifecycle initiative. A classic example is as you're building applications and as you're deploying services, you need to be able to understand which operational environment that service is actually being deployed into. That will actually allow you to report on when a particular application reached a particular stage of its life cycle, and hopefully over time prove that you're becoming more and more agile. Closing the loop also allows you to feed back service levels and availability and uptime statistics back into your development and planning tools so that you can see, hopefully, an improvement on your availability of applications and services in your environment. You want to be able to automate the enforcement of policies within the environment and ensure that your operational environment matches what is happening inside your development repository. The thing I see more often than not, and the thing that ultimately leads to a stagnant SOA practice, is that the operational environment has no correlation whatsoever to what is happening in your development repository. And the reason for this is that without a mature operational process, people end up doing ad hoc things in the operational environment and not updating the repository. If you close the loop and you integrate the tools, then there is no way that something can happen in the operational environment that hasn't already been pre-approved and registered within your repository. A classic example, looking at SOAP web service, just as an example. If a message comes into the ESB for a particular SOAP service, but that SOAP web service has not been registered in the repository, you need some way of either discovering that service or reporting on the fact that you have a rogue service within that environment. If that service matches a service within the repository, you need to join those dots together and you need to start reporting those statistics on the service as it is represented in the repository. So that allows you to then make sure that your operational environment is always an accurate reflection of what is happening in your planning and development stages of the life cycle. And this is kind of what I mean by closing the loop. It is not a trivial thing to do. It's difficult to come up with a representation of a service during development and somehow correlate that to messages running on the wire, but I believe that it's an essential part of making this whole thing work and ultimately getting reports that are meaningful at the end of the day. So just to conclude, you need to get business support for an SOA initiative. Don't put all your eggs into one platform or a single product and try and do everything using a single product. You can't just purchase an ESB and say, I'm done with SOA, or purchase a repository and say, I'm done, we now have an SOA. You need to look at the entire life cycle. You need to purchase different tools, or at the very, very least, put policies and practices in place that you can get effective reporting. You need to consider the entire life cycle, or else you won't be able to show success or justify the investments that you've made. You need to automate and streamline key use cases. So you need to be able to provide a carrot to developers and operations managers and business managers and say, I'm going to increase agility in such and such a way by such and such an amount, and I'm going to be able to reduce our risk inside the operational environment by automatically securing all credit card numbers based on schema, something like that. So you need to identify, automate, and streamline those key use cases by integrating the products together and automating the processes that you've identified. You also finally need to be able to audit and measure your success. Report on your success and say, hopefully at the end of the day, that you're saving $2 million per year because you've demonstrated an increase in efficiency, a decrease in risk, an X amount of reuse within your environment. So Vance, I'll give it back to you for any questions.
Excellent, Alistair. Thank you very much for a terrific look at some of the best practices out there and how they've matured over the years in SOA, and especially with this business focus. I think it's a great topic to explore, and our attendees agree because I've got quite a few questions lined up here. So with your permission, let's turn to questions.
Sounds great.
The first question here, Alistair, goes to one of the topics that you mentioned in your solo, but also earlier today in your keynote session. And the question here reads, what are the biggest trends you see in SOA to cloud architectures, either private or public cloud, and where does SOA governance fit in?
That's a great question, Vance. I think that SOA governance is a prerequisite for effective cloud computing. And what I mean by that is cloud computing means a lot of things to a lot of different people. Cloud computing could be software as a service. So let's look at that. If an organization wants to provide software as a service, then those services need to be effectively governed, they need to be effectively managed, and they had better align with the business because that is your business. If an organization is looking at leveraging software as a service, then you have practical considerations about how do you actually transfer company data, how do you actually communicate with that environment, which of their services should you use, how do you represent that service to internal development organizations, how do you control access to that service by internal development organizations. So I think that SOA governance is intimately involved with both the exposure of services and the consumption of services in the SaaS context. If you look at cloud computing in the context of a platform as a service initiative, then what we're seeing is that organizations are creating internally platform as a service initiatives to streamline their IT organizations. And what we find then is that the concept of governance is broadened to include the applications that you're building and the infrastructure that those applications need to run on. So if they need to deploy an application, say for instance, a banking application, they need to know that they need to deploy X amount of infrastructure to support that particular application. And that relationship needs to be managed somewhere, and those relationships need to be understood, and all of the change management and governance activities wrapped around that, we find are an extension to the existing SOA governance things that organizations are doing.
Many folks, I think, have an artificial lid on their embracing or adoption of cloud because of concerns about management and control and some of the things that I think many folks associate with SOA governance. Are you finding that as people begin to kind of marry the concept of cloud to what they know about governance, that they tend to get a little braver or a little more aggressive in their cloud adoption?
Yeah, I think it's about predictability, right? I think that people don't understand cloud necessarily at first, but once they get a handle for it and they understand the parameters in which they can use cloud within their organization, and they understand how they can control a set of outcomes using cloud infrastructure, and they understand how their SOA governance might integrate with the systems they put into place around infrastructure as a service, things start becoming a little bit more clear and the outcomes are clearer, and people start gaining confidence in cloud as a whole. So I think you're right. I think that governance is kind of a prerequisite for cloud because it gives you a sense of confidence that it's not the Wild West and that you're not exposing customer data, that you're not putting yourself at risk, that you understand what is running where and how it's running and what SLAs it's supposed to meet.
Really good point. Really good point. Turning back to another question now, in your slides you mentioned people should come first, so it's only appropriate that we ask a people question here early, I think. The question here reads, how common are SOA COEs with IT and business stakeholders both involved? And if not a COE, what other ways do you see business leaders working with IT?
So yes, Vance, we definitely see a lot more business focus when it comes to SOA. In some respects, it's actually driven by cloud computing and the fact that people want to save money, and cloud computing becomes a way to save money. So SOA then, as a prerequisite to effective cloud computing, starts becoming more involved in business conversations. We're also seeing a couple of other emerging initiatives as well. So software as a service is ultimately a business discussion. But when you look at the technology, it's SOA. So what we're finding is that cloud, software as a service, and even things like mobile APIs are becoming things that the business person understands and the business person is driving the need for. So the natural response for that is centers of excellence that include members from the business and a clearer alignment to the strategic business initiatives and ultimately a more successful SOA. So what we found is that cloud and SaaS and mobile application development is providing a crisper focus for SOA. It's providing a business context for SOA. So we've definitely seen a big change in the customers that are implementing SOA and why they're implementing it.
Speaking of that, there's another theme here that maybe we can tackle. And the question here is, we're looking to identify integration projects that offer much bigger payback to the business. Does SOA Software offer any visibility or self-assessment tools to help us?
Well, certainly within our portfolio management tool, we have tools that do exactly that, to help you measure and prioritize which services should be built and which initiatives should be tackled first. It is an exercise that an organization needs to undertake because you need to understand what your business initiatives are. You need to understand what your current architecture is. You need to have visibility into what your to-be architecture is going to be. And then you can start figuring out what is core and what is not, what you need to preserve, what you can farm out to a SaaS provider. And you need to understand what the relationships are between the services to figure out what the dependencies are and which ones need to be built first. So absolutely, that process that I just described is what is provided by products like our Portfolio Manager product.
And what strikes me as going back to the question before is that I would assume that those kind of tools actually help put IT and business on somewhat the same page, at least the same chapter.
Absolutely. The one use case that comes to mind most readily is mobile application development, and it's a huge growth area for us. When you look at mobile applications, there's a large amount of unpredictability to the market. You never know whether a mobile application is going to be ragingly successful or a complete dud. And the mobile applications themselves are often led by the business, so you have a strategic benefit there. You have typically a marketing group within your organization that's creating this cool new mobile application and marketing it to your customer base. But at the end of the day, you ultimately have to handle the pragmatic things around how do I provision this API to this mobile device, how do I expose it to the outside world, and how do I manage its service level. And you need to be able to control the service level. You need to be able to throttle and manage the quotas associated with different mobile applications. You need to somehow be able to automate that. And there's also an interesting tie-in with cloud computing here is that you could actually burst your capacity into a cloud environment to manage excess load.
Alistair Farquharson, CTO of SOA Software, thanks very much for this view of SOA circa 2011 and how SOA Governance is really expanding its imprint, and especially for taking so many questions.
Thanks, Wes.